Hey fearsome friends, creepy teachers, we've all had them. Keep your kids safe out there and listen to them. It could save a lot of upset or even a life. So sit back, relax and get cozy, comfy, warm because it's time to let your nightmares in. So I recently saw a post on TikTok that made me think back to this creepy male substitute teacher that I had in middle school. I was around 12 or 13 at the time and attending a class with only one other kid in it. It was a computer class, and we sat on opposite sides of the row of computers. The young male substitute teacher was helping the other kid, and once he was done, he asked if I needed help with anything. I politely said no because I knew what I was doing, but he didn't like this answer and insisted that he should come and help me. I kept declining though and let him know that the other kid needed his help more, but he ignored me and just sat down next to me. He sat so close that his thigh touched mine, so I kept inching away from him, but he kept moving closer. This went on for 45 minutes until the bell rang. And at the end of class it was my teacher's policy that we get candy if we had passed tests that day. I hadn't passed any due to my lack of focus on my work, because of the creepy teacher touching my thigh. So he let the kid, who was male, have candy for his past tests, then offered me some. I informed him that I hadn't passed any tests, so I shouldn't get any, but he said he wouldn't tell if I didn't, and kept insisting that I take some candy. The other student had already left by now, so to avoid being alone with him, I took my moment and ran out of the room when some kids were passing by. I ran because I knew I had 4 minutes until my next class, and I also knew his next period was free, so we would be alone. I would need a late pass from him if I stayed any longer. I later told a teacher I trusted whose classroom was down the hallway, and he had already had his eye on the guy. The teacher walked me to and from every class in that hall for the whole week the sub was there, and thankfully never had him in my class again. I'm a female, and when I was in high school aged 15 to 18, I was always in advanced maths, which meant Calculus 1 and Calculus 2. There was another maths class as well, but I don't remember the specific subject, and for all 3 years of high school, I had this man as a teacher. If a female had a question, he would sit as close as possible, as in thigh-touching thigh with his hand on their neck. If a male had a question, he would bend over the top of the desk with no touching at all. This creeped me out. At the time, which was the 90s, there had been a satanic panic in the US where a bunch of kids educators were fired for rumors, and at this time everything was bouncing back, so that every educator was automatically believed over any child. As I said, I was 15 to 16 when I first met this teacher, and 17 to 18 when I had my last class with him. I don't know what prompted me to tell my mum about his inappropriate behavior. I just knew I had to tell someone, because he was so very obviously creepy. I will never forget my mum's reaction. "Don't you ever say that about him. He's a good man who lives with his elderly mother and volunteers to teach migrant farmers children." I learned right then that my mother would believe an adult paedophile over her daughter, and I never shared any of my feelings about strange kids or adults ever again. To be honest, that this grown-ass man had that much control over a bunch of kids who may not have spoken English very well, and the fact that he never dated or moved away from his mum, creeped the hell out of me. Although I never heard of him actually touching a kid, I wouldn't be surprised if he did. Kids should never be subjected to any of this kind of behavior from an adult, let alone a teacher, and the adults in their lives have really let them down, especially in the stories where it's generational pedophilia. Like if a parent had that teacher and then did nothing to protect their child from them. When I was in 7th grade, I had an older English teacher whom my parents worked with a long time ago. At first, I thought that was pretty cool, and I was super friendly with him. For my first year, he'd always bring me candy, give me extra work when I asked for it. I like to study, so I'm not nervous at my exams, and he would let me and my friends have lunch with him in his classroom. After a while of this, my friends started teasing me by saying that I had a crush on him. They would joke about it a lot in class, and I don't know if he heard, but he started being even more friendly from then on. I told my friends to stop, but they were very toxic, so they didn't listen. One winter night, it was really dark outside and my dad had a very important meeting, so he was only going to be able to pick me up at 5 p.m, and I didn't take the bus that night because I went to an after-school activity in music, so I was just sitting on the bench by the door, playing some game on my phone, when he came out of a nearby hallway and said, "Hey, why are you at school so late?" Now, because of my friends teasing me, I didn't want to talk to him, so I just said that I was waiting for my dad to pick me up. He proceeded to offer me a ride home, as it was obviously getting late, but I said no. He kept insisting though, and I got annoyed, so he eventually left. I told my dad about it, and of course he was glad I didn't accept. After that, he stopped being nice to me and became very cold, but I didn't care, and the next year I didn't see him again anyway. Now, I don't know if I was justified in being creeped out, but he genuinely made me feel like he was grooming me. Plus, I was only 12. I'm 16 now, and I don't know if I was being weird because of my friends, or if he was actually creepy. She was a quirky woman, loud, vocal and fun to us 13-year-old kids. I've not really thought about this until I reunited with one of my childhood friends who'd emigrated, and we reconnected 10 years later, whilst overseas back in 2011. I've opted to share this story on here to get your opinions. One day she told us that her husband was sick and in bed, but it was bizarre. She'd said that the doctors couldn't figure out what was going on, except that he was going through puberty. Yes, puberty. She must have been in her early 30s. Obviously, as 13-year-olds, we were bewildered and wondering what was going on with her husband, and what did she mean he was going through puberty. She then went on to say that his penis, yes, his penis, had started growing bigger and bigger, and doctors couldn't understand why. He was in excruciating pain because of it. I can't remember what else she'd said, but my friend told me he went home crying, and when his mother asked why, he told her the story and what the teacher had shared with the class. She complained to the principal, but nothing was really done about it, albeit she was a phenomenal English teacher. Thinking back though, how bizarre. It was so wrong that she'd said this to a class of 13-year-olds. This happened a few years ago when I was 18 to 19 years old and had started taking driving lessons. First was the theory, which ended in a written test, and then came the practical. Now, I was never really interested in learning how to drive, as I lived in a suburban area next to a very big city, so public transport was rarely an issue. Still, I knew it was an essential skill to have, and I didn't want to end up being that one person in a group who always needed a driver, so I took the lessons. The theory part was fine and easy, but when it came to the practical, I was very nervous and not confident at all. I wasn't doing too badly, but I wasn't great either. In my driving school, each student basically had a main driving instructor, so they could track your progress more closely. My main driving instructor always seemed a bit, well, weird. Not in any alarming way, just that he wasn't someone that I'd ever want to hang around with. He was in his 50s or at least late 40s, was very overweight, and had very long nails, at least for a man, which for some reason I found to be very creepy. He had a relatively soft voice, too. For the first few lessons, everything was fine, and he wasn't very talkative, with only giving me directions. But as I progressed from only using the wheel to using the pedals, and then the gear shift, he started being more open. One thing I noticed was that he always complimented me, even when I did something very simple that I'd already done several times, and he never said when I did anything incorrectly, which obviously I did plenty of, so it bothered me. Because even though I certainly didn't want to be yelled at, I still needed to improve my driving, and it wasn't going to happen this way. Then one day in particular, at the end of the lesson, we parked up near the driving school, and he leaned on the side to reach me and kissed me on the cheek to say goodbye. It seriously weirded me out, but not as much as you'd think. You see, in my country, that's what we do to say goodbye and hello to people, although it's not done in a professional setting, and certainly not between teacher and student. So it was weird, but not overly alarming. Another day he said that he was going to buy me a coffee when I passed my test. I said sure, as I didn't see anything wrong with my driving instructor buying me a €1 coffee at the machine in celebration. Except that a couple of lessons later, we were talking and happened to pass in front of a McDonald's, and he joked that when I pass my test, he'll take me to a restaurant, but a much better one than a fast food chain. I wasn't doing that. Another red flag. On one lesson, the director of the school rode in the back with us, as he was doing checkups on the students, and suddenly my driving instructor was doing his job perfectly, asking me if I had any questions, going over what I'd done wrong and what I'd done right, and behaving like a real, normal driving instructor. It felt nice for once. So by this point, I was 10 times more nervous going into the lessons. I kept making excuses to cancel. But in my country, driving lessons are extremely expensive, and you can only cancel 48 hours before, so I couldn't afford to lose any money. I just wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. But the problem was, I wasn't making any progress. A couple of times we did a bit of overtime, like 5 or 10 minutes, nothing major, and he once told me that he could give me private lessons, and that they'd be our little secret. The kissing thing kept on for a few lessons. He had even put his hand on mine over the gear shift a few times, or touched my leg as an excuse to reach for something. Then he did the one thing I just couldn't take. He must have looked at my file and gotten my phone number. He then sent me a text, just asking an innocent question about the time of our next lesson, except that this kind of stuff goes through the secretary, not the instructors themselves. That's when I decided to act. I just couldn't take it anymore, and I obviously didn't want this creep to have my number. So when I went to the secretary and asked to change instructors, when she asked why, I let everything out. The stress, the harassment, some of the things he'd said and done. She was horrified, said that of course she'd switch me to someone else, but also asked that I go to the director and tell him everything, to get this guy fired. So I did. I knew he was a good person, and only a couple of sentences in, he had his head in his hands in pure despair. He asked for a screenshot of the texts, which I sent him, and said he would do his best. But where I live, you can't just fire someone on a whim. You need proof, solid reasons. A few days later, I got a new instructor, one who had no issues pointing out my mistakes. It hurt a bit, actually, especially when I realized that I was much worse than I thought, and that most of my lessons had been completely useless. Still, it was a nice change to be treated like an idiot. The creepy instructor wasn't fired for a few weeks, so sometimes I sadly crossed paths with him, but he always avoided looking in my direction. I guess he knew exactly who'd ratted him out. I admit it frightened me a bit, that he'd tried to do something in retaliation. 2 things happened after he was fired, which makes this whole story even worse. Now, I worked in a fast food chain, so I was around lots of other people my age, and when talking to one of them, we realized that she too had issues with him. Same kind of behavior, except that she was luckier because she'd passed her test not long after she'd first had a lesson with him. You have to know that physically we couldn't be more different. She's black and I'm white. She's thin and I'm overweight. She has long hair and I have short hair. So did he just try to hit on every single girl he came into contact with, despite being married obviously, no matter who they were, hoping that he'd get one in bed? What about the many minors he must have come in contact with? Lastly, the day I passed my test, with only one mistake, the director of the agency told me that a few days earlier he'd seen the creepy instructor in another driving school car with another young girl sitting next to him. Right now he's probably still out there, traumatizing young girls like me. Maybe he'd even managed to go further than he'd got with me, and this upsets me to no end. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.